Hello and welcome back to another episode of Autism Family Life, bringing you all things autism, family, and life in 30 minutes or less. In this week's episode, we are going to get back to and kind of continue on the mental health track that we've been discussing in a couple of the past few episodes. And one of the main things that I want to talk about in this week's episode is dealing with clinical depression and just depression in general, as a parent, caregiver, or, just as in general. But before we get to this week's episode, I would just like to remind you to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever it is that you are listening to your podcast, to please leave me a review. Just let me know how I'm doing, give me a shout out, or if you have suggestions for future episodes, just let me know. And if you are tuning in on YouTube, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel for updates and for related videos. And yes, once again, if you are tuning in on YouTube and it looks like I haven't changed my clothes yet, it's because I have not. I batch record these, just to kind of try and save me some time. So, let's get to this week's episode, and once again, this week's episode is going to be talking about depression. It was one of the first things that I was kind of willing to be open with on my blog, Corey at Home, and I figured it was high time I should get around to it here on the podcast. And I was diagnosed with clinical depression. It's now also known as major depression, when I was 14 years old. And I've had 2 points in my life where I was actually taking medication for my depression. The first medication I took was Prozac, which, I think a lot of us have been on at one point in our lives. And then the other medication that I was on was for Celexa. And, there's no shame in being on medication. If medication is what it takes to help you get through the day and get through, life, then do it. You absolutely do it. For me, I wanted to be able to manage my depression, or at least, learn coping strategies and techniques where I could keep it under control so that I didn't have to be on medication all the time. But I'm also acknowledging to myself that there's nothing wrong with medication, and I have no problem whatsoever going back on medication if I really need to. So one of the biggest things with me, with the mental health issues and then with the depression in particular, was knowing that I did have, kind of a family health history with mental health issues, even if it wasn't always discussed. And one of the biggest risk factors that I faced personally was, a couple of traumatic events when I was younger that I never really dealt with until I was an adult. And, or not even as an adult, but then, I kind of ignored and I didn't want to deal with it. And, even back then, I think like my therapist kept telling me that, for all intents and purposes, I looked very much and acted very much like a normal person. And it was true. But I was masking so many different things in my life, not just the depression, but I also had a really crappy sense of self-esteem, which would probably stem from the depression. I had, a borderline eating disorder. I had what's called body dysmorphic disorder. So the way I saw myself in the mirror was just not how other people saw me. And it took me well into my 30s to finally get that positive self-esteem and finally get a positive self-body image. This was, again, all stemming from issues that I suffered with and dealt with or didn't deal with as a teenager. And then after my daughter was diagnosed with autism, I went through a bit of, as I've talked about it before, I went through the disenfranchised grief with her. I've had a couple of traumatic incidences with her that very closely like resemble the PTSD symptoms. Like the everyday caregiver stress, I would say that factors into how I deal with things now or how I don't deal with things. It is for me, and I'm going to be getting into this into the next episode, which is covering anxiety. Because when I can keep my anxiety in check, I can keep my depression in check most of the time. But that was just it for me, is that if I can keep some of the other mental health issues that I have kind of in line, then most of the time I can keep my depression in line. But if I can't keep all that other stuff together, then my depression spirals out of control. And one of those big things is keeping my stress under control and keeping my stress, at a manageable level where it's not overwhelming and where it's not consuming. Which is tough, I got to admit. It's not the easiest thing in the world to do, but it definitely helps. And, I try to exercise daily. I'm trying to be very mindful, or at least more mindful of my diet and what I'm eating. And then I try to partake in some hobbies. I go to church. I'm in my church's choir. I have my blog. I try to do some other things that aren't fully for work or for, that are just for me. I have tried the gardening thing. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't, because I don't really have a natural green thumb. And then I get frustrated because I can't keep these things alive. But, having those hobbies and then having things where I can take a mental break from things or focus my thoughts elsewhere or kind of redirect my thoughts elsewhere, that really helps. And then, there's a fine line for me with the blog and with the podcast even of, how much do I want to be sharing? How much of this vulnerability really am I willing to show and share? And then I've come to realize too, it's like, this can be a very cathartic process for myself. Just being able to be open and candid about it. It does take a lot out of me because I don't always like talking about it, because some of those wounds are still very fresh and some of them I still haven't fully dealt with. Even though, I can tell you that most of the time, if I can keep certain things under control and I can keep other things in check, then I can keep the rest of my mental health issues in check, which is true. Sometimes it is still very difficult for me to deal with. And, I know that I need to be able to deal with these things on my own terms and that I'm handling them probably as best as I possibly can. But then, I've had people say before, it's like, you don't look like you have depression. And most of the time when we think of someone who has depression, we think about someone who might be sad, or that, they have this overwhelming sense of like worthlessness and sometimes even insomnia. And while these are like the more common symptoms that people talk about, sometimes my depression looks like a lot of anger and it looks like a lot of mood swings. It's not always sadness for me. Sometimes it is those severe mood swings and this like extreme irritability to the point where everything, it just kind of sets me off. And, sometimes it's the seasonal affective thing. It's called SAD, seasonal affective disorder. And, that's more like, okay, I just need to it's like cabin fever to the extreme almost. And then, there's sometimes the depression has been linked to like a lack of focus, a lack of motivation, and lack of determination. Which this one is kind of confusing for me as well. Just because I think I've mentioned in some previous episodes before that I am a huge fan of like those self-tests and self-diagnostic things, even though I probably shouldn't be, because, I want to be able to get official results. now I'm really starting to wonder how many of my mental health issues are those true mental health issues like the depression or like the anxiety, and how many of them could possibly be adult ADD or, the ADHD, inattentive type, but they're just now manifesting, or that they're just now showing up as they are. And, I don't say these things to be offensive or to offend people who do have adult ADD or who have adult ADHD. It's just one of those things that, I recognize all these things in myself as an adult. And when I was younger, it was different when I was younger. So much has changed now, and so much has changed in terms of the diagnostic tests and the signs, the symptoms, and everything else that we look for. And just like autism looks different in girls, and especially like the high functioning autism, or Asperger's as it used to be called, that looks different in women. ADD and ADHD look different in women. And so, sometimes it just makes me wonder, it's like, how much of this is the actual disorder or the actual the mental health issue that I've been diagnosed with, as opposed to something else that could be beneath the surface. So it's one of those things that eventually I think I will be pursuing in terms of, official diagnostic and all of that. And it's not so much for a peace of mind for myself. I mean, that's part of my motivation for it. But the main thing is learning how to cope with these things and learning strategies, techniques, so that I am, becoming the best functioning person possible. I have no desire to be normal, because normal for me has always been just a setting on the dryer. I have the desire and the drive to want to be the best possible person that I can be, to the best of my capability and my abilities on any given day with any given circumstances or situations that I might face. And whether that's learning to manage depression, or learning to manage anxiety, or learning better time management techniques, or learning how to better focus, or, really doing any number of things, that's what I want to learn. And that's what I'm hoping to achieve in terms of getting some kind of diagnosis. And I have the same approach when it came to my daughter, in that we know that on paper, her official diagnosis is autism spectrum disorder. But in some of her, her testing, both by the classroom teachers and then with paperwork that we filled out, she comes and she presents symptoms of ADHD. She presents some anxiety. She presents a lot of OCD tendencies. And I'm sure if we kept digging, we would see some other things, like some intellectual disability and things like that. But we haven't had those things, those other things, the comorbid things, as they call them. We haven't had those officially diagnosed yet. And, there's a part of me that would want to get that officially diagnosed, just so we can learn those specific strategies to address those specific things and those specific parts, so that it's a more complete picture, so that it's a bigger picture, it's a more complete set of strategies and tips and techniques and things like that. But at the same time, it serves our purposes just as much to treat the main things, and the things that are more obvious, the things that are more evident, and then the things that I think we have more control over. And it's not just doing those things, but it's also altering the environment and creating this sense of routine, this sense of structure that really helps her make the most of the situation around her and the environment around her. Because ultimately that's, what I want to be able to do for her. And it's not so much then about, changing her or changing the things that she's doing, but it's adapting the things around her, and it's adapting the environment around her. And, for myself, I've noticed kind of the same things, in that it's not always about what I'm doing for myself and what I'm, the changes that I'm making in life, but it's the adaptations that I'm making to my routine or the adaptations that I make to my environment or any other given number of things. Like one thing that I started doing recently that's helped me with my time management was syncing everything to Google Calendar. And then, taking the next step and writing it down in a happy planner. I've looked into other planning systems. I've tried the bullet journaling thing. That's been on and off for me. I just have to be consistent with it. So that was my other big struggle was, finding the perfect thing to manage the time. Because if I'm not managing my time, I get anxious about it. And when I start getting anxious about it, I start not focusing on things. And then that just makes the whole situation spiral further and further. So, even then, when I'm trying to do things that are getting my environment under control, it just makes it worse. And then I just find myself kind of micromanaging or trying to put out one fire after the other instead of kind of getting to the root source and the root cause. Which is another thing that I think we'll get into in a couple of the later episodes, maybe sometime sooner than later, just because, summertime's coming up and sometimes our summer routine looks a little bit different than our school year routine, but when we can have that structure and everything like that during the summer, we're better off. So maybe that'll be on our episode next week. We'll see. I think it will be on our episode next week. So I would invite you to tune in next week, or maybe we'll just make it a special episode, and it's going to be covering structuring the summer routine for your autistic child to bring about more predictability and stability for them, and how a summer routine can also help you as a stay-at-home mom, stay-at-home parent, or caregiver to your autistic child. And I look forward to talking to you about this, and I hope you have a great day.